Hello and welcome to The Banker's Top 1000 World Banks ranking for 2023. I'm Joy McKnight, editor of The Banker. And with me in the studio is Barbara Pianesi, who's Latin America editor and who also wrote the cover story looking at the results of the Top 1000 World Banks ranking. Barbara, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much, Joy.
So you were the one that did the deep dive into all the data to really discover the big trends that came through in 2022, which is the year-end results that the Top 1000 World Banks ranking is based on. Obviously, one of the big things was the impact of a strong US dollar. So how did that impact the rankings?
Yeah, so the results are expressed in US dollars. So this is quite relevant as last year the US dollar appreciated quite a bit against some of the major world currencies. So in some countries, the results when expressed in dollars may seem kind of lower than what they really are. So this is really an important factor to take into account. And also on the aggregate level, if we see the main metrics such as Tier 1 capital, total assets, and pre-tax profits, we see that all three indicators seem to be kind of lower than last year. But it was mostly the effect of this, the strong dollar.
Excellent. And then obviously the other thing that happened last year in 2022 was really the different rises when it comes to interest rates. Obviously the US Federal Reserve was one of the ones that drove up interest rates, which also impacted the dollar, the strength of the dollar. What kind of impact did these rising interest rates have on the business of banking?
Yeah, so first of all, we need to consider that in the past decade, banks have been operating in a low interest rate environment. So this is, I think, that last year, 2022, was a bit of a turning point for the banking sector. And usually when interest rates are higher, banks tend to have higher profitability. And indeed, that was the case last year. So they managed to increase their net interest income in many cases. Despite, again, that probably with the strong dollar, it was not super evident. So it was positive, but at the same time, interest expenses were also growing faster. So it means that banks basically, instead of relying just on deposits for their funding, they are relying on a number of securities, which are more expensive because of this higher interest rates environment. So given that interest expenses appeared last year to grow faster than interest income, this means that in the long run, profitability for banks might be in peril, let's say.
Excellent. And of course, the Top 1000 World Banks ranking covers the globe, and it's ranking by Tier 1 capital. You know, what were the regional stories that you could highlight for us?
Yeah, so there are many stories, I think, and that was quite interesting. I think that regarding China, what is interesting is that also in the past editions, we always talk about how Chinese banks are growing, and this is still the case. But I think that nowadays, the growth seems to be driven by different factors. So in the past, there were more like large banks that were driving this growth. And nowadays, it's more medium-tier banks that are responsible for most of the growth, and they are growing faster. And also in terms of profitability, there is a kind of slowdown of profitability, which doesn't mean that they are not profitable, but it just means that probably the banking sector in the country has reached a certain state of maturity, if it makes sense.
Okay.
And then if we look at Europe, for example, we had good performances in Greece and Italy, which are two countries that in the past few years experienced some troubles. In Greece, of course, their banks have managed to clear up their balance sheets and to decrease their non-performing loans ratios, despite nowadays the banking sector in Greece is much smaller than a decade ago. And if we then look at emerging markets, I think two mentions is India and Brazil. Brazilian banks have done well despite, again, the Brazilian real, the national currency, appreciated against the dollar. So, but they did it well, and also in India they did well.
Excellent. My last question is really about who's on top of the ranking. Obviously, you talked a little bit about China's slowdown in general, but are the Chinese mega banks still at the top?
So in the top 10, we have 5 banks from China, and 4 of them are in the top 4 positions. So obviously, the growth of the Chinese banking sector has been a trend in the past few years, and I think in next year, what we expect to see is probably to see maybe one more Chinese banks, especially probably as the currency, the foreign exchange will be kind of more favorable to China. And there is just one European bank, which is HSBC.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your insights, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Joy.
So you can read Barbara's cover story, which dives into the deep trends of the top 1,000 world banks ranking on thebanker.com/top 1,000.